When I was a kid, I was fascinated by those big Citroens. They just sort of floated along majestically. They had headlamps that could see round corners and were so low they appeared to have no wheels at all. They'd whir and tick and hiss and curtsy oddly as you got in and out. To a car-crazy 10-year-old, they were the maddest thing I'd ever seen and looked just like a spaceship that had fallen from the sky. This is the story of a Gallic goddess, the Citroen DS. When the car was launched, it literally rocked the world. People were amazed. No other single event since the death of Stalin had generated as much publicity and as many column inches. Remember, this was 1955, when the world was just getting over the excitement of electric razors. Then along comes this slipstreamed, futuristic vision, and everybody just went, wow. On the day of its launch, Citroen drove a convoy of the things up the Champs-Élysées and were pursued by hundreds of people shouting, "Une déesse, voilà la déesse." And today, 40 years on, you look at it and it is still like something from another world.
It was like riding on a magic carpet. It was fast, it was sleek, it was very, very comfortable. And above all, it was different.
Even today, it is still such an unusual item. It is a marvellous thing to drive.
It was the most rational and revolutionary car of all time.
You can drive any car along, but if you're driving this along the road, heads still turn to look at it.
It was incredible. Just loved it.
The DS's revolutionary forebear was the 1934 Traction Avant, one of France's favourite cars, until the Gestapo commandeered them all during the war. Citroen tried to keep the Traction's replacement a deadly secret, but in one of the first motor industry scoops, the French car magazine, L'Auto Journal, splashed a prototype across its pages no less than 3 years before the car's launch. But the secrecy continued. At the 1955 Paris Motor Show, even after all the other cars had taken up residence on the stands, there was still a pregnant hole awaiting the Citroen. But 45 minutes after it did appear, 749 people had put in orders. At the end of the first day, no less than 12,000 had paid a deposit for the brave new Citroen. Driven by Gina Lollobrigida, it made the front cover of Paris Match and just about every newspaper in the world. And it was as radical to drive as it was to look at. There was no clutch. You had a semi-automatic gearbox. That's why you see all DS drivers with their hand perched neatly on the top of the wheel, ready to just flick the lever along like that. Works extremely well. The single-spoke steering was power-assisted, and it was front-wheel drive, shod with specially designed Michelin radials. It was the first production car to have front disc brakes, hydraulic of course, but instead of a conventional pedal, you had a mushroom-shaped button on the floor. Only the French. And the big Citroen's greatest technical ingenuity, and remember this was 1955, was its self-leveling hydropneumatic suspension, which supported the car on a cushion of fluid and made it ride like the prototype magic carpet.
The elasticity of the air and the flexibility of water are combined for your comfort in the Citroen hydropneumatic suspension. Each wheel is linked to the body by a piston. This piston acts on a liquid which compresses a gas contained in a suspension sphere. The counter effects of these elements maintains the body horizontal at all times.
Now it became possible to sit the car not on metal springs, but on 4 bubbles of compressed nitrogen. And a compressed gas, a trapped gas, is the finest spring you can get. Because you had this high-pressure circuitry for operating the suspension and operating the brakes, which incidentally enabled you to have really powerful brakes at the front, where all the work was primarily done, Citroen made their own disc brakes. Nobody else's were good enough, of course. And so this was the first production car to have disc brakes, and very well they worked too.
In fact, the whole thing worked well, and even today, some say that for a mass-produced car, the DS is technically unsurpassed. The DS was so ahead of itself that in its 20-year lifespan, it was hardly changed at all. The only major revision came in 1967, when Citroen sharpened up that nose and gave it its shark snout. Plus, of course, its most famous party trick, headlamps that swiveled with the steering. So proud was Citroen of this avant-garde device that they indulged it with its very own bit of cinema.
The DS is a car that was made way ahead of its time. It was made in the past, but definitely has a place in the future. My first impressions of the DS were formed as a small child watching programs like Thunderbirds and Stingray, and the shape of the DS, that kind of bulbous and then tapered off shape, reminded me of Thunderbird 2, a big pod carrier that used to carry Thunderbird 4 around, and also Stingray as well. So when I first saw a DS, I thought, wow, they've actually got a Stingray on wheels. I called my car Imelda after Imelda Marcos, because at the time when I bought the car, she was being indicted for fraud in the Philippines, and it just seemed an appropriate name to call it at the time. Also, she's gorgeous and she's brown. Aesthetically, she's very pleasing to the eye. Most people, when they see her for the first time, look at her lines and her shape, her curves and her big bulbous eyes. When you drive one of these, people can't help but to look at you. You can pull up next to a Porsche, or you can pull up next to a Range Rover and they can't touch you. You can raise or lower the suspension and you're in a class of your own. You're driving a car that's got more history, more style, more impact than most cars on the street today. Also, it's got a lot of chrome on it.
Acres of legroom and a cavernous boot meant that the DS was hugely practical and very, very, very accommodating. Bristling with all those clever little touches that mean so much. And that amazing suspension made the DS one of the few cars in the world that could perform a trick like this. Indeed, the philosopher Roland Barthes was so captivated by the car that he dedicated an entire essay to it, arguing that it was the 20th century equivalent of the medieval Gothic cathedral.